Welcome to today's episode of Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance, a podcast series brought to you by Trulient Talks. I'm your host, Indy Alawalia, and I'm delighted to navigate the dynamic world of pharmacovigilance and risk management with you. But first, a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individual guest and do not necessarily reflect the official views of Trulient Consulting. We're all about fostering insightful conversations here at Trulient Talks, and we want you to know that any product vendor or service mentioned does not imply an endorsement. If you're seeking professional advice for specific situations, we encourage you to go to our experts. Please remember this podcast content is meant for informational and educational purposes only. Now, that's out of the way. Let's get back to the show. Today, we are incredibly fortunate to have Sue Rees, the founder of Sue Rees Consultancy, as your guest speaker. So get ready to be inspired, informed, and engaged in what will be a fascinating conversation. So welcome, Sue.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
And thank you for being for coming onto my podcast. I know I've been talking about this for a long time, and it's finally here, and I'm so happy that you're here.
No, it's great. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm interested to see where it goes.
Exactly. And just a little personal note, Sue was my second manager in professional environment. And I just wanted to say thank you, yourself and Sharon Adams, who first brought me into PV. Who knew 15 years later I'm still in PV? This is absolutely crazy. So I just wanted to quick personal thank you.
You're very welcome. It's great as a leader to see people that you work with in the early days of their career, kind of see them go on and flourish and do greater things. So I'm always really excited when I see that happening. And there are a number of your compatriots as well who've gone on to do great things. And I'm sure you'll probably have some of them here on your podcast as well.
I'm hoping. So, Sue, for those who are uninitiated into the Sue Rees world, why don't you give me a brief summary of your career? And actually, more importantly, and a question that I think I like to ask anyway, is how did you get into PV?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'll try not to go on too long about this because I have been kicking around for a very long time. I think my official bio says over 30 years. So, I started off, I had a science background, did a science degree, went to the lab, hated it. And so was looking for a new job. And I was in those days, we're talking a long time ago, you looked in the back of the New Scientist magazine for a job. And there were adverts in there for jobs. And I saw this one that was to work in the adverse events department. And it turned out it was written by a guy called Dave Lewis. Many people who listen to this know Dave Lewis. And if you know Dave, you will know that he has a way with words. And so this job advert sounded amazing. It was about educating prescribers and, working on really important safety issues. And I thought that sounds really interesting. So I applied for the job to go and work at Kline French, as it was in those days, as a safety scientist, and I got the job, and that was the start of a very long and fruitful career in safety. So it started off. My job was to it was part sort of information. We were part of the medical information team, so you'd pick up the phone. Somebody would be asking a question about the product, reporting an adverse event. You would take the details, you would provide them information, and then you would work with a group of staff who did the actual sort of coding and check the cases were correct, and provide the information. And that was the start of it. And I stayed in the SmithKline organization for 17 years, started off at affiliate level. And then I went to work in the global team, and I headed up a post-marketing group. And then they reorganized post-merger, and I headed up a therapy area group there. So got to work across post-market. I always say I'm a post-marketing girl at heart. That's where I started. But then, ended up working on clinical trial development products, seeing much more safety evaluation from that side. And then, after many years there, moved on, different organisation, back to an affiliate level group, and then into a European role, my first QP role, which is obviously when I worked with you at ASI. And that was fascinating, not just taking on a QP role, but also managing affiliates across Europe and other regions, the dynamics with a Japanese company as opposed to a British company. And then kind of my last role in industry was at Amgen, where I was QP again. Again, different organization, different dynamic, US company, didn't really know much about Europe, spent a lot of time banging the Europe drum. Saw the company go from having, 6 or 7 products to 15 products over the space of a few years, very innovative, working with an amazing team, and, was very happy in the QP role. I loved the QP role. I loved what it gave. I loved the fact that I could legitimately have a finger in every pie. I loved that variety. And then Brexit. And, that was the end of my corporate career because, I was very established in the UK. I wasn't going to leave the UK. Amgen, just for its setup, really didn't really have other senior roles based in the UK. And so I kind of went, okay, maybe it's time to retire. And I kind of thought that's what I was doing. And I did for about 3 months. And then somebody approached me about a project and then another one. And before I know it, I set up my consultancy and I haven't stopped working since.
That's fantastic. It's amazing how you felt that was it, the end of your corporate career, and suddenly, I'm still in demand. I'm still, and I believe you're also doing some work in educating as well.
Yeah. So I happen to live very close to the University of Hertfordshire, and people may know the University of Hertfordshire in the early 90s was very innovative and set up a post-marketing degree in pharmacovigilance. Back to the infamous Dave Lewis. That was his kind of setup. And I'd always been involved with that. I'd been a guest lecturer on and off for it. And so because I had time on my hands, I kind of just contacted them and went, anything I can do for you? And they kind of bit my hand off and brought me in initially as a visiting lecturer. And now I'm actually a member of staff. They're a senior lecturer. I run 2 modules on that post-marketing degree. I also run a module for the EU2P, which is like a consortium of European universities that run an online master's course in pharmacovigilance. So I'm now a senior lecturer. I did a qualification in higher education, teaching and learning. So I'm a qualified lecturer. It's a really interesting kind of element. I always feel it feels a bit like giving back. Although it is an employment, it's working with people early in their career quite often. It's a great way of staying in contact with a lot of people because we bring in numerous guest lecturers. And I, obviously I sit and listen to those lectures too and get to hear kind of latest thinking. So it's just a really interesting element that I didn't necessarily think I was going to be involved in, but actually I'm really enjoying.
It's absolutely fascinating. And actually, I was just thinking back to your career. You've pretty much worked with the 3 major components of the world: Europe, the US, and Japan. You were talking about the differences between those companies. I'm guessing you mean culturally.
Yeah, culturally, but also their they're kind of the focus of Europe and European legislation. Because I think it's very easy when you work in Europe or in the UK, which was part of Europe at the time, is you kind of think that's the only thing you have to take into account. And it's very easy, particularly in a role like a QPPV role, where you feel, what you want, what you say has to happen. And it's actually really interesting to have those conversations where, you kind of go, but the FDA wants this. Or, but in Japan, this individual also has accountabilities, and you have to kind of go, oh yeah, actually there is a broader horizon, and PV impacts everybody, all of our patients globally, and we can't, it just helps lift your horizons, I think.
And actually, there's a part of me that I want to get onto Brexit and the QP role, but actually there's a part of me that's been thinking about this a lot recently, which is the fact that there have been a lot of talk about the convergence of regulations throughout the world. But actually, has it actually become divergent? Has it basically become more localized than before?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. I remember quite a few years ago now, I did a DIA meeting, and we were talking about this globalization, and I did a talk, and I kind of was talking about right size pharmacovigilance, because there is a desire, there seems to be this overarching desire, like I say, for regulations to converge and to be the same. And from a pharma industry point of view, from a global pharma industry point of view, of course, that's what we want. We want to do something once, and we want to then give it to everybody. We don't want to have to keep doing the same thing, but in a different format or different timeframes or whatever. But actually, from a country-specific point of view, you don't necessarily want to be overlaying the complexities of something like the European pharmacovigilance system on a country that is only just starting its PV journey. If the country is just putting in its first legislation about reporting adverse events, it couldn't cope with the complexities of an FDA or an EU system. And so I think we have to acknowledge that it's right size pharmacovigilance, and that, yes, there is an element that says, if, Mr. Regulator, you are putting in your first legislation about pharmacovigilance, please consider 7-day and 15-day reporting. That would make everybody's life so much easier. But don't expect them to take the entire GVPs and apply them straight away. And I think we have to kind of acknowledge that. So I do think there is that element, which is, it's not necessarily divergent, but it's different. But then there is the other element. And, the classic example you see of this, or the one we talk about a lot, is the FDA's attitude towards clinical trial reporting, where they've gone, don't send us everything, just send us the really important stuff. And you have to kind of applaud that and go, that makes so much more sense. Why, it would be really good if everybody followed that. So I think there is a divergence, but I think in a way it's good divergence, because I think it's twofold. It's one, it's acknowledging that there are baby steps at the beginning, and the second is it does take somebody brave to go off down a slightly different route. And what you have to hope is that eventually everybody will realize that and follow them. We're just in that bit in the middle where it's kind of like, well, they're going that way and they're going that way, and actually I have to serve both of those, and that's making my life difficult. But I wouldn't want to stop that kind of bravery of the regulators. And I know you're talking about Brexit, and I think to a certain extent, my hope is that the MHRA do that they then go, do you know what? We now have the opportunity to kind of speak up for what we truly believe in. And if we are brave and go in this direction, maybe other people will follow. It's difficult to tell, because if you are the lone voice, you do either end up in that scenario where everybody follows, or you just are a lone voice and you end up having to kind of become irrelevant. So it does take that bravery. I don't think the MHRA are there yet, but I know when I spoke to some members of the MHRA kind of pre-Brexit, they were sort of saying that's what they aspired to, but I'm not sure we're there yet.
And actually, the MHRA and Brexit is again a very interesting piece to talk about, because obviously with Brexit, the role of the QP within the UK had obviously disappeared. But I guess the thing that and I and many other people had thought of was that the MHRA's voice within the EMA was always very loud, and it was always very powerful. Obviously, they have now stepped. They're no longer part of the EMA because of Brexit. Has this changed the way that the EMA and the MHRA are perceived internationally?
I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I don't know that it has. I mean, I think the EMA obviously is still, the representation of Europe. It's still a very, very loud voice. And I think the fact that like you say, the UK element, the MHRA element was so strong, I think has shaped the way, it's in the formative years. June Rain was head of the PRAC in its formative years. And I think it has shaped the way for the way it's going to go. So I think the fact that the UK is no longer part of that, I don't think has impacted the perception or the kind of the broad shape of the EMA and the way it operates in pharmacovigilance, at least. I can't talk for other parts of it, but in pharmacovigilance. I think what's interesting is the MHRA's standing, because I think certainly with the sort of clients that I work with, a number of them are kind of small West Coast clients. They are still very much keen to understand the MHRA's thinking. I think they are, a number of companies I work with are applying for EU and UK licenses. So they very much want to know what's the MHRA thinking, what's the, inspection processes. We know the MHRA inspectorate is the inspectorate in the world still, and so I think the MHRA still very much has that view, that kind of the perception, I don't know, from organisations. They want to satisfy the MHRA, they want to satisfy the EMA. So I think that's, neither of them have lost out, and are still very important as far as organisations are concerned. I think, what will be interesting, I suppose, is time. Will the MHRA start to diverge? Will the MHRA start to be seen as irrelevant lone wolf, or will it be seen as an innovator and leading the way? Will EMA start to change? Somebody said to me the other day, I had an interesting conversation with somebody. We were talking about patient information leaflets, and MHRA had always been a pioneer for patient-friendly language, ensuring that patient information leaflets were usable, were readable. They'd started doing some pilot work on including broader information in the patient information leaflets, etc., sort of pre-Europe, as it were. And so this individual, we were talking with them and sort of saying, did we think MHRA were going to go back to that route? But also he sort of said, now that the EMA has lost the MHRA's pragmatism, they was concerned that the EMA would kind of almost go more severe, more close-minded. That's not the right word, but maybe more rule following. If we think of some of our European colleagues in some countries, they have a very stereotypical sort of, we must follow the rules. And I think there was a concern that the MHRA's voice, once it's gone from that maybe that becomes the dominating way forward, which I hadn't really thought about, and I thought was a really interesting sort of comment. Was that hole that the MHRA and the UK staff going to be filled by perhaps the more sort of hardline element?
Yeah, it's interesting. And a couple of conversations I've had about the MHRA recently have been things like, how are they able to, with our government, the UK government, and the funding that they have compared to what they had when we were in Europe, and how are they able to be able to commit to all these inspections, to be able to be innovative? Or is the fact that because their budget is so decreased, that actually they have to be innovative simply to survive?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly it. I think, what drives you to be innovative, and I think if you talk to the great innovators, I think that kind of, something has to happen. Something has to drive you to be innovative. If everything is comfortable and everything's staying the same, there's no impetus to change. And so the fact that they have been through such a big change and, let's say, a potentially resource constrained has, kind of forces the innovation. So, we saw already, the fact that they were already starting to do more things like remote inspections. And then obviously COVID then kind of pushed everybody down the remote route. And they really embrace that, and then going to carry on that way. The fact they've changed their inspections now to be less kind of overarching and more specific. They've gone, we're not going to look at everything for everybody. We're going to target, and we're going to target in these specific areas. So I think it does drive you to change and innovation. And I think no matter what element you're looking at. It is that, something always has to trigger an innovation. And if you're comfortable and things are all happy and, it's not a great inducer to do something different.
No.
But, hard times or resources or big change are the things that make you do something differently.
And talking about innovation and big change, obviously, like I said, I've just been to the World Drug Safety Congress in Europe. And the big thing, absolutely every track, I think there were 11 tracks, and every single track touched upon this, which is AI. And I know, Sue, you're not the most fascinated when it comes down to systems and AI. But I want to bring a different maybe perspective, because I heard a couple of things which irked me. I wasn't there in the session, so I can't actually vouch for any of this, but it was a conversation I'd had with someone. And the conversation had said that within one of the sessions, someone had said, you could teach a data analyst PV, but you can't teach a PV person data analytics. And that really irked me, for starters. And secondly, it got me into another thought, which was, I'm not science based. I did law. I came into PV, and I was very lucky that Sharon had picked me to start doing data entry. And then it took a while, but I did finally get it and start doing well within PV. My thought then goes into this path, which is, well, how are the new people going to come into PV? I mean, data entry was the path for the majority of people. So what do you think the future is for people like me, essentially? How do we get into PV?
Yeah, and that is an area that I've had discussions and thoughts and spoken about quite a lot, because you're absolutely right. Case processing was always seen to be kind of like the entry level into PV. And, we've already seen that declining over the past 10, 15 years with a lot of offshoring of those sort of roles from UK, Europe, US. And so really diminishing that entry level. And, it is concerning that, we are potentially throwing people into quite a complex arena. I mean, let's face it, we don't talk normal English when we're talking PV. We have all of our own terminology and phraseologies. It is a complex area, and we're throwing people into that, at a more senior level. And I've seen this a lot with people coming into science roles, or particularly with physicians coming straight in, where potentially they're just not seeing the big picture. We've also got to that role now. When I started, which was back in the dark ages, you did a bit of everything. You did a bit of cases, you did a bit on the analysis, you spoke to the regulatory team, you went to meet the regulators, There was a lot of that, and now we've kind of, because functions have got so much bigger, the roles have got narrower. You are a safety scientist for one particular product, or you are a compliance person, or you oversee cases, or we've got these very kind of narrow roles, and so I do think we need to be more innovative on how we bring people in. I don't have a problem bringing people in, to be a safety scientist, but we have to make sure we give them the opportunities to observe and understand the PV system. We have to make sure we're giving them excellent training, that they are able to understand, not just their link in the chain, but the whole chain. How does information get to them? What does a case look like? How is it processed? Okay, you might not be a case processor, but you need to be able to find your way around the database. You need to understand which fields are auto-populated by AI, which are typed in. Where does that information come from? You need to understand, the all of the caveats that come with the spontaneous report. You and I know that, the information you get is very limited, and how it's kind of forced into a database to a certain extent is quite variable. So you need to understand all of that. You need to understand where your piece leads next. If it's then going on to be reviewed by a physician or a more senior scientist, what are they looking for? What are the key bits of information? If you make an analysis of cases, what's the potential impact of that if it then goes to your safety review committee or whatever, So I think we can still bring people in, and we absolutely still need people to come in, but we need to kind of fill the gaps. We need to give them excellent training, whether that's in-house, whether that's external, whether that's sending them off to get a post-marketing degree, whether it's, whatever it is, we need to, and we need to rotate people. I was always very keen on, moving people around. As I said, as a leader, it makes me feel really happy when I see people like you doing really well. But, for me, I was always, if somebody came to me and said, I'm resigning because I've got such and such a job, I was always really happy for them, because I wanted them to move and get new experiences. And I've certainly been in a scenario where people have left, they've gone to work for other organizations in different teams, got different experiences, and then they've come back more well-rounded, more senior, and able to move on to the next level. So I think it's beholden to us as leaders to ensure that we are giving people the training, giving them the opportunities, moving them around, so that they can then be the us of the future. I got that just almost serendipitously through the roles that I had and the organizations I worked in. But we now have to work to make sure other people get that really well-rounded view, because otherwise, the systems aren't going to, the PV system isn't going to work if people don't understand where they fit in that whole chain.
I think that just brought back a memory of when I did resign at ASI, to say when I got the job at Amgen, and I think the first words, I was very nervous. And I think there was some sort of event happening in our building. I went to you and you just went, fantastic. And I was like, oh, I did not expect that as a response. So I was like, wow, she wanted to get rid of me, but there we go.
No, I never wanted to give people. And I always used to say, tell me you're moving to a better job.
Yeah.
If I felt somebody was moving to the same job in another company, I felt I'd failed. But if they were moving to a better job, a different job, a new opportunity, then absolutely fantastic. But if you're moving to the same job somewhere else, then I felt I'd failed them. So that would be my response.
How do you feel that, again, we're going down the systems path a little bit, but again, maybe more of an alternate view. We have several companies out there, let's say that, or vendors, who are essentially trying to converge everyone to their way of thinking. And these particular vendors all think they have the correct way in which to do certain bits of safety, be it a signal software, be it case processing software, a database, be it just how to deal with emails, for instance. They all have their specific nuances. And a company like Trullian, this isn't meant to go like that, but companies like us who go in and, look at their processes and say, well, you're not necessarily matching the system here that you've currently got. But the thought comes, as I've worked at product companies now, I've worked at 2 product companies, where decisions are being made by people who actually don't really know a lot about safety. And isn't that a bit of a worry as well?
Yeah, I mean, nobody can know everything.
No.
And as a safety person, you also know that, if you want to bring in something new, you have to get the buy-in of other parts of the organization. Usually safety has very little budget. If you want to do anything new or innovative, you have to kind of go cap in hand to whoever's got the money. And the other thing I found with working with particularly smaller organizations is the layers between safety and senior management are very small. And so often that person who is in charge of safety, let's say, isn't really a safety person either, because they're having to look after clinical and medical and lots of other things as well. And the true safety expert is actually somebody really quite junior. So yeah, that's what happens. I think the best organizations are those where safety is respected for what it is. So whoever is representing safety, helps the organization understand the good and the bad of what's needed, and is respected for that. And I think if you have that, then whoever is making the decisions kind of understands what is needed. That doesn't mean to say they're an expert, but they respect the information that's coming from the experts, and they understand that safety is a core element of any pharmaceutical company and needs to be done correctly. I mean, that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I think it's important that whoever is making decisions for safety understands the why and not just the what. And I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in the what.
Yeah, I think
what are we doing? What is the time frame? What is the compliance? What system are we going to use? Rather than the why are we doing this? What is the end goal? What are we trying to achieve? And it's not compliance at all costs, and it's not compliance at no cost. And it's around, I always, and I have to, I'm no, saint at this, but you have to sometimes pull yourself back and go, actually, what is going to keep the patient safe? That's what we're doing this for. We're doing it to ensure that the patients who take our products, are able to do so in a way that is of biggest benefit and of smallest risk. And all of the rest of this is driving us to that goal. And whether it's a database, whether it's an audit, whether it's a signal, whether it's, that's what it's all driving to. And so sometimes you just kind of have to go, okay, step back. Do we need it? Talking about systems, I had a conversation with one client a few months ago where they were determined they were going to spend an awful lot of money on some very fancy signal detection software when they had one product with 200 cases. And I was like, no, but we need it. And we need to play with the big boys. No. A, you don't need it. B, it won't work. You just need to look at your cases each month. That's all you need to do. It's not very sophisticated, but that's actually appropriate for your size of database. If you want to do something fancy, pay somebody to go and look in FDA VAERS database or Vigibase or something, but don't bring that in for your own database. It won't work. And so I think, it's not the what it's the why. And if you've got a good head of safety who can represent the safety organization to whoever is making the decision and have those conversations, then you kind of hope the right decisions are being made.
I think that's absolutely fair. I obviously talked about my experience, but I think exactly what you're saying. I was thinking back at so many heads of safety, or chief medical officers, as they ended up going up into, and how many of them actually cared about safety. I think there was always this safety is the cost factor that we have to do, and that was it really. But going back to another point that you were talking about outsourcing and the fact that jobs are being outsourced. I've noticed a little bit of a trend where people are starting to think of a more hybrid model where they have some of the work outsourced, and it's not necessarily just case processing. I've seen certainly where aggregate reports are outsourced, some of the signaling are outsourced. There's all parts of safety that could actually essentially be outsourced. But it does seem that some of the bigger guys are sort of coming into this sort of hybrid state rather than fully everything outsourcing. And I was thinking back to a few years ago where outsourcing was a big thing, and then suddenly everyone brought it back, and then it went back. And I was just thinking, is outsourcing essentially just cyclical?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, every outsourcing was the thing. Everything was outsourced or offshored or, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of it was, cost and efficiency driven. And organizations then kind of went, oh, perhaps we've done too much. We've lost, back to your point, we've lost the expertise. We've lost the knowledge of our own PV system. And we need to bring some of that back, or we need to make sure that we've got really good oversight. I think the focus now is on oversight rather than necessarily the doing. I've always said it's delegation, not abdication. From my mind, that's the key thing. Whatever we do, whether you call it outsourcing or partnership or offshoring, whatever, you are delegating your responsibility as an MAH. But you cannot lose sight of it. You are responsible for that. You are accountable for it. You haven't completely abdicated your role there. And so the focus is on oversight and quality, which I think is absolutely right. Whether it's cyclical, I'm not sure. I know I once had this conversation when I was leaving one organization and going to another. And it was at a time where there seemed to be a lot of churn between, do you have people who do all elements of the case processing and safety evaluation, or do you separate your groups out? And I said to people, I'm under no illusion that this company I'm going to is on a different cycle. It's just a different place on the circle. So the fact that they might have two groups, at some point they'll bring them back into one, and then they'll separate them out again, and then they'll offshore them, and then they'll bring, So I do think there is a certain cycle that we go through. I think all organizations, all organizational design, whether you're talking about PV or any other organizational design, is to a certain sense cyclical, because it just is. You reorganize. Everybody will have been through numerous reorganizations. Either within a company or they move companies. And you go through phases of cut. Oh, we haven't got enough people. Grow. We've got too many people. Cut. And then it's like, well, we're going to split the groups. We're going to join the groups. We're going to have an expert doing this. We're going to have a center of excellence. Now we're going to bring it all into one. Now we're going to split the groups. Now we're going, because organizational design, there's only a certain number of ways you can do it. So I do think that's it. And I think with a lot of with the offshoring, there's that. I don't think we're necessarily going to ever come back to, though, within PV, of organizations having sort of giant in-house case processing centers for two reasons. One is, I think, the cost it is proven to be, more cost efficient to operate in other countries. And secondly is the AI thing. I think, we've always had, certainly in my lifetime, a level of auto coding, auto listedness, auto narratives. And, I think those are going to get better and better. We've already seen, the use of natural language processing, et cetera, and things to kind of pull out adverse event terms from large volumes of text. It's inevitably going to go down that route. So I don't think companies are going to then have 20 people sat in a room, in the center of Europe somewhere entering cases. I don't think that's necessary. I think there will come a time when they won't have 20 people sat in a room in India or the Philippines doing that, because that will be taken over by AI. But what they will have is people ensuring that those processes are robust, that they are looked at, that there is a sense element, call it QC, call it QA, call it review, call it, whatever. But, you can never take the scientific and medical evaluation out of safety. You can take away the kind of, typing bit, but you can't take the brain power out of it. And, you need to ensure that that's still there. So I think there'll be a shift to the emphasis, but we're never going to get rid of ICSRs. We just are going to get rid of, change the way in which those get from point A to point B, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And actually, there was one more point that I had in my head when you were talking previously, which was about how safety is perceived in companies. And it's a pretty simple one, but do you think COVID and the COVID pandemic increased the visibility of safety within companies?
It certainly did in the wider world. I've spent 30 odd years trying to explain to people what my job is, usually covered with a pretty glazed look. Come COVID, suddenly, certainly in the UK, June Rain from the MHRA was on the telly all the time. People were talking about side effects. People were being told to report them. It certainly got a much greater visibility than it had done previously. So I think certainly, within the general population, there was an elevation. And I think for the vaccine manufacturers, I think, safety was obviously a very key element, and that's the same with, I think, for vaccine manufacturers, for any vaccine, because, and I used to work on vaccines when I very first started in my career. And it was always that thing of you were giving something to a perfectly healthy individual. So the safety element has to be so high. Unlike a medicine, a drug that you're giving somebody who's sick, vaccines you're giving to healthy people and quite often to children. So the safety element is always a high part of that discussion. So I think for the vaccine manufacturers, safety obviously was very critical. For everybody else, did it have an impact? I don't know. I mean, I think, and obviously I sort of came out of the corporate world just before COVID. And so it would be really interesting to talk to somebody who still works in a corporate environment. But I think the shift to remote working has potentially, I was going to say damaged. I don't know if damage is the right word, but I don't think it's helped the visibility of organizations like safety, because safety has always been seen to be a bit of a backroom thing. Mm-hmm. And I know, the best organization I worked for that really had safety at its forefront was Amgen, and that was down to an incredibly inspiring leader. But she made sure we were visible. You had to be in the meeting room. When we went to the meetings of the sort of top 500 in the organization, we had to sit in the front row. We had to make sure we went up and introduced ourselves to the senior leaders in other parts of the organizations. She made sure that I went out to the US at least 4 times a year to be visible. And there was that whole thing about visibility to ensure that safety was in people's minds. And I think the fact now that people kind of sit at home a lot of time, don't go back into the office necessarily, a lot of it's done remotely, I think that has not helped the visibility of safety and probably a number of other parts of the organization, because you're kind of losing that human touch and that visibility. So in that respect, I think COVID and the knock on to the remote working has probably not helped it for many organizations.
That's a really fair point. I guess when COVID hit, I was just I was in a product company, so for me it was a very different experience than being within safety itself. I guess I've got to ask my final question. And this podcast is called Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance. And the reason why it was named so is because that's what I'm interested in. It's where are we going next? We've there's been so much disruption recently. Like we've talked about Brexit, we've talked about COVID, and where are we going? And this isn't necessarily just about systems or AI, etc. This is just the future. We touched upon how do people enter into PV, and so what are your thoughts? It's a big question.
It is a big question, and I think there are lots of different elements to it. I think AI is obviously a big thing. I think the way we gather data, the way we put that data on the database, I think is going to change. We've seen it already. It's definitely going to happen. I think the type of careers we have, as we said, is inevitable. That's kind of changing. And I think, the legislation is changing. I think will change. I think we will see that divergence and then hopefully coming back together. I think, to a certain extent, the legislation kind of has to play catch up. I know you and I have had a bit of a conversation about ICH E2D, which I was involved with at the beginning, the revision. And the aim of that was to try and bring legislation that was written in the early 90s, up to speed with all of the different ways we're getting information in now. And one of the reasons, I'm not involved now because I had to step down when I left the corporate world, but, I still try and follow it. And my understanding is one of the reasons that's taking so long is actually the divergence, because you're trying to get people in a room to come to a consensus, and everybody's legislation is different and everybody's wants and desires are different, and trying to come to consensus is actually proving really hard. So I do think that we are going to see more divergence in requirements. And I like to think that hopefully we might come back together. Maybe we get to that point where everybody is entering data and gathering data, through I would say AI is a very vague term, but using all of those technological advances. Maybe we get to the point where that's all happening almost kind of automatically. So you don't have to focus on that anymore. And therefore the more clinical scientific judgment part is where the legislation really lies. And that can come back together because we all agree the end goal is the same. As we've said, it's to keep patients safe. So I think maybe we're going to see a bit of a fuzzy period for a while where there's, people are exploring these new tools. The legislation is going a bit all over the place. And maybe ultimately, I was going to say not in my lifetime, not in my working lifetime, but, ultimately it might kind of come back together because we don't have to worry about the ICSRs. It's kind of that just kind of happens. And we focus on the evaluation and the judgment. And because we all have the same end goal, it comes back together. Don't know. Watch this space.
I think that's exactly it. Watch this space. Well, Sue, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.